Our limitless universe, hidden by the barriers of time and space, has existed unknown and unexplored, seemingly forever beyond the reach of man. He has marveled and pondered about its origin and purpose, and dreamed of reaching those distant worlds. This never-ending struggle to overcome those barriers has provided us with a drama-filled tale of adventure, one unequaled in world history. This is the story of that adventure, one that has a beginning, but no end. As the centuries passed, curious vehicular designs appeared for travel to the moon and planets. These and other strange devices were the forerunners of ships that would carry latter-day Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, and Star Trek crews across space.
Hello, I'm astronaut Alan Shepard. We've come a long way since those early days when we could only dream of the moon and planets. Spaceflight has sparked the imagination since humans first became aware that there were worlds other than our own. Those early ideas, both whimsical and thoughtful, were the serious beginning of man's conquest of the heavens. Blueprint for Space tells us how these dreams eventually became reality and what lies in our future.
From the earliest beginnings, man noticed the stars and planets, and gradually his mind opened to the universe around him. 4,000 years ago, Babylonian astronomer priests recorded the movements of the planets, and gradually a better understanding of the heavens began to evolve. As his knowledge expanded, man's imagination enabled him to create tools such as the telescope to study these new worlds, and he yearned to discover ways to reach them. Many of these concepts were quite imaginative. The key to space travel is the rocket. The Chinese are credited with devising the first rocket sometime in the mid-11th century. But it wasn't until the 19th century that the idea of using rockets for space travel occurred to the master of science fiction, Jules Verne. In his books, From the Earth to the Moon and Round the Moon, he described a giant cannon that propelled a spacecraft guided by onboard rockets. Modern society owes much to Verne, whose genius and concepts inspired generations of scientists and engineers. For hundreds of years before Jules Verne, the rocket had been employed in warfare, and in the form of fireworks for entertainment and celebrations. But their development was slow, and they remained of minor military importance, many times the source of amusement and ridicule. In 1792, during the Battle of Seringapatam, Indian troops effectively used rockets against the British Army. As a result of lessons learned in India, Britain's William Congreve went on to achieve a major advance in rocketry by developing rockets that could reach distances of over a mile with improved accuracy. Congreve and Congreve-derived rockets were widely used in the 19th century. In the United States, during the British bombardment of Fort McHenry, the rocket's red glare inspired Francis Scott Key to compose the Star-Spangled Banner. World War I saw a limited use of rockets mounted on aircraft. But World War II resulted in technological breakthroughs that became the direct harbinger of the space vehicles that would follow. The discovery that the reaction principle is the key to space travel was one of the great milestones in human history. It not only solved a problem that had intrigued mankind for ages, but opened the universe to human exploration. As early as 1909, Robert H. Goddard, a New England professor, had concluded that liquid propellant rockets would be ideal for launching payloads into space. However, during World War I, he concentrated on the development of solid propellants, which were tested on mounting stands such as this. As soon as the war was over, Goddard again turned to liquid-powered rockets and pursued their development for the rest of his life. Working under a small grant from the Smithsonian Institution, Goddard gradually solved the complex problems inherent in liquid-based systems, and in the mid-1920s became the first man to launch liquid-propelled rockets. Meanwhile, other great spaceflight theorists, among them Konstantin Tsiolkovsky and Hermann Oberth, independently had thought about liquid propellant systems too. These men also played important roles in arousing widespread public interest in rocketry as applied to spaceflight. Born in 1857, Russian scientist schoolteacher Tsiolkovsky is regarded as the true pioneer of astronautical theory. He was the first to understand the use of rockets in space travel, and in 1903 incorporated liquid hydrogen and oxygen as propellants in the design of this spaceship. Still another astronautics pioneer, Hermann Oberth, was born in 1894. His work inspired young German enthusiasts to form in 1927 the Society for Spaceship Travel. Soon afterwards, some of their number began testing rockets in a specially prepared rocket flying field in the Berlin suburb of Reinickendorf. Many consider this site to be the birthplace of modern rocketry and space travel. One member of the fledgling band of Rocketeers was young Wernher von Braun, a protege of Oberth. After the war, Oberth came to the United States to work with von Braun.
Men like Wernher von Braun, who many consider history's greatest rocket engineer and space visionary, led the team that designed both the modest Redstone and the gigantic Saturn V rockets. On May 5th, 1961, I had the good fortune of becoming America's first man in space when a Redstone lifted my Mercury capsule into a suborbital flight. 10 years later, my Apollo 14 crewmates and I were given a mighty ride to the moon by a flawlessly functioning Saturn V. Wernher von Braun was a man of incredible vision. In a real sense, he was the father of space exploration. His insights and plans carried far beyond the imaginations of earlier pioneers. 40 years ago, von Braun was proposing elaborate scenarios for large stations in space, outposts on the moon, and landings on Mars. And now, 4 decades later, those visions are carefully examined under America's Space Exploration Initiative. Within the lifetime of many of us living today, von Braun's dreams could become a reality. His story is one that legends are made of.
Wernher von Braun was born in Wirsitz, Germany on March 23, 1912, the son of Baron Magnus and Emmy von Braun. His father served as Minister of Agriculture in President von Hindenburg's administration. In 1930, young Wernher enrolled at the Berlin Institute of Technology, where he pursued studies while working closely with Oberth and Rocket Society members in testing primitive rockets. Meanwhile, in the United States and Russia, similar devices were also being flown with varying degrees of success. But it was Germany where rocketry was destined to flower, as the country secretly prepared for the most devastating war in history. Driven by a desire to develop weapons that were not prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles, German Army ordnance experts carefully observed the rocket experiments being conducted by the amateur experimenters at the Reinickendorf rocket flying field. The result was the sudden hiring of von Braun in 1932 and giving him technical responsibility for the Army's embryonic rocket program under a secure military environment. By 1934, the German army was developing their first flying rocket at the Kummersdorf Proving Ground near Berlin, while German amateurs continued to work on their own projects like Gerhard Zucker's experimental mail rocket. In 1937, the Germans launched an A-3 rocket that reached an altitude of 1.5 miles and produced 3,300 pounds of thrust. Under von Braun, development proceeded smoothly at the new German rocket center at Peenemünde, where the A-4 rocket, later renamed the V-2, was being prepared for testing.
Ergebenheit! Dieses Deutschland singt gut! Wir halten Deutschland! Mit stolzer Freude seine Söhne in euch!
In January 1943, there was a dramatic change. Under the pressure of military setbacks, Der Führer decided that missiles might win the war for Germany, and he gave top priority in men and material to the V-2 program. Von Braun and his team were dismayed, believing that the war would end before the rocket was ready for combat. They looked upon it as a mighty achievement on the road to the moon and planets, not as a weapon of war. Historians today consider the V-2 the direct ancestor of all modern launch vehicles. But the development of the V-2 was not without failures. As hostilities neared an end, despite it still being an experimental stage, Hitler committed the awesome V-2 to military operations. Beginning in 1944 and lasting for many months, V-2s rained destruction on targets in southeast England and recently liberated areas of Belgium. Its development was of similar magnitude to the American development of the atom bomb. By early 1945, it had become apparent that the Third Reich was in the throes of final collapse. Confusion was rampant in Germany and Peenemünde. As the Russians approached from the east, von Braun decided that he must save his rocket experts and valuable research records by surrendering to the Americans. As the Russians neared, von Braun and his fellow engineers and scientists gathered volumes of records and quantities of valuable equipment. At great risk to themselves, they made their way by truck and train past Gestapo checkpoints. And surrendered to American authorities in southern Germany in May of 1945. Von Braun and 120 colleagues began arriving at the Army's Fort Bliss in Texas in 1945. Meanwhile, parts of some 100 V-2s had been shipped to the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. Operating under the code name of Paperclip, von Braun, his fellow German scientists and their families began a new life, American style. During the next 6 years, the Germans and their American colleagues refurbished and launched nearly 70 V-2s. While undertaking upper atmosphere research, one V-2 reached 114 miles altitude, and another boosted an American Wac Corporal rocket 244 miles above the Earth. Man was already probing the frontiers of space. In 1950, von Braun and his teammates left Fort Bliss and White Sands for the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. For a number of years, he served as technical director of the U.S. Army Ordnance Guided Missiles Development Group, and beginning in 1956, as Director of Development Operations Division of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. In 1960, this division was transferred to NASA, forming the nucleus of the just-created George C. Marshall Space Flight Center. Von Braun would direct the center for another 10 years before being transferred to NASA headquarters in Washington. During the quarter century from 1945 to 1970, he and his team would write important new chapters in the history of rocketry and space travel. Von Braun had dreamt of space travel since boyhood. During the war, he managed to keep this interest alive and was once jailed by the Gestapo for neglecting his duty to develop the V-2 as a military weapon because of time he spent pondering spaceflight concepts. When he had settled in the United States after the war, he came to realize that he must sell his convictions not only to his superiors in government, but to the public as well. For the rest of his life, he would cajole, persuade, and reason with anyone and everyone on the virtues of space travel. Hugo Gernsback's Amazing Stories, the first science fiction magazine, was published back in 1926. It was the beginning of the popular promotion of space travel. Magazines were to become the dominant form of science fiction in the first half of the 20th century, and would prove to be an important factor in building public awareness of the promise of spaceflight. For the next 25 years, this promise drew many of the great names of science fiction: Edgar Rice Burroughs, Arthur C. Clarke, E.E. Smith, John W. Campbell, Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, Ben Bova, and Ray Bradbury. These are only a few of the names of the dozens of individuals who made important contributions to the promotion of space awareness. The V-2 had a tremendous effect. It took hold of the public's imagination, becoming synonymous with spaceship. It looked great, and it was a real spaceship. By the time the 1950s arrived, these dreamers, theorists, and scores of others had not only established that space travel would ultimately take place, but had anticipated virtually every step on the road to achieving it. The motion picture also played an important role in crystallizing the image of the spaceship, although its initial influence was not as great as science fiction magazines. In 1929, Fritz Lang's movie The Girl in the Moon caused a stir when it introduced the first realistic spaceship in movie history. The technical consultant was none other than the famed astronautics pioneer, Hermann Oberth. In the early 50s, realizing that popular public support was essential, von Braun began a 25-year-long public relations campaign promoting space exploration. In 1955, he appeared before the Armed Forces Staff College and stunned his audience with incredibly visionary, bold proposals for conquering space.
Guest speaker, Dr. Werner von Braun. Dr. Braun. Gentlemen, the conquest of outer space is the greatest technological challenge of the age in which we live. The first decisive step in the conquest of space will be the placing of an object into an orbit wherein it will indefinitely circle the Earth. You see a model of a three-stage rocket on this picture. Up to this lower white line here is the first stage. It is powered by a number of rocket engines which will lift the missile off the ground until it has reached the second stage, likewise exhausted, would be dropped. Now the rocket motor in the last or top stage will take over until the final orbital speed of 18,000 miles has been reached. This speed is sufficient to keep the top stage in the orbit. Shooting people into an orbit, we have to provide ways and means of returning them safely to the surface of the Earth. Here we have replaced the top stage of the rocket by a winged airplane type stage which would carry personnel to the orbit.
By the 1950s, it was becoming clear to some that space travel was no longer an idle futuristic concept, but actually was within reach using existing technology. This was pointed out to an astonished and fascinated American audience by von Braun himself. From 1952 to 1954, in a series of spectacularly illustrated articles in Collier's magazine, von Braun proposed an elaborate space program. From an unmanned satellite to a manned mission to Mars, every step was explained in extraordinary and convincing detail. His remarkable insight was the first to fill in the many details of the blueprint.
After dedicating most of his life to the advancement of astronautics, Braun was finally able to lay out a grand blueprint for the conquest of space. History has clearly shown that the Collier series of 8 articles, published over a 2.5-year span from 1952 to 54, had far-reaching impact on the public and the scientific community. To assist in explaining the novel concepts in the series, Collier's art director hired 3 of America's finest illustrators to work with their writers. It was a fortunate decision for the 3. Chesley Bonestell, Fred Freeman, and Rolf Klepp soon created a series of stunning visuals under the supervision of von Braun. They stand unsurpassed as the most influential works of their kind ever completed on space. The momentum created by the Collier series continued after the final issue. The series had come to Walt Disney's attention just as he was planning a new television series, and he quickly became an ardent space enthusiast. Soon, von Braun and several of his colleagues were named technical advisors in a 3-part Disney series based on von Braun's visions of space travel. The programs were an instant hit and contributed to growing public interest in space. The conversion of von Braun's theory and designs from sketch to blueprint to finished art was a complex one. Von Braun created his spacecraft by first preparing engineering drawings of his concepts, as these original examples reveal. His 1953 Baby space station was to be orbited by a 3-stage rocket whose upper stage would contain the payload.
On the right side of this picture, you see a large wheel-shaped space station, which should be construed more or less as a proposal as to what you could possibly do with a space station, and it is not necessarily a proposal that a space station must look exactly like this thing, in particular must be that large. In fact, it can be a lot smaller if you want to reduce the equipment aboard or prefer to have several smaller ones. The wheel shape has been chosen for the purpose of doing away with the permanent weightless condition prevailing in the orbit. By putting a spin on such a wheel, you could provide an artificial or synthetic gravity in the rim. Inside, such a space station may contain all sorts of equipment. There will be laboratories in the rim where phenomena can be studied which are not accessible to experimentation on the ground. Such experiments may include questions involving biological and zoological life under the conditions of outer space, cosmic radiation, meteorological research, whereby the Earth can be observed from the outside, astronomical laboratories, etc. Close to the space station, there will be a powerful telescope. If you aim this telescope at the heavens, you can see the planets unblurred by atmospheric effects, and we can expect to be able to take photographs of planets like Mars or Jupiter with unprecedented clarity.
These plans were made by Wernher von Braun in 1952. Now, 4 decades later, the United States is assembling the world's first multi-use space platform at the Marshall Space Flight Center and elsewhere. Although of a different design, America's new space station Freedom will embody many of von Braun's original concepts. Beginning in 1946, and for the next 3 decades, a large part of the nation's progress in rocketry was due to von Braun and his team. One of the early creations was the Redstone missile. Hermann Oberth, von Braun, and Dr. Charles Lundquist contemplate their plans for placing a satellite in orbit using the Redstone. It was later terminated in favor of the Vanguard satellite project. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union won the satellite race by orbiting Sputnik 1, and America's feelings about its space program were changed forever. Then disaster struck. Soon afterwards, President Eisenhower called upon von Braun to urgently proceed with his own orbital launch plans. And on January 31st, 1958, a Redstone rocket orbited Explorer 1, which discovered the Van Allen radiation belts. Soon other von Braun rockets would be lofting more American satellites into orbit. America was in space to stay. 3 men were responsible for the success of Explorer 1. Dr. William H. Pickering, Dr. James Van Allen, and Dr. Werner von Braun. Project Mercury, the country's first manned space program, was given the go-ahead just 1 week after NASA was formed on October 1st, 1958. 7 test pilots were selected to become astronauts. Donald K. Deke Slayton, Alan B. Shepard, Walter M. Schirra, Virgil I. Gus Grissom, John H. Glenn Jr., Leroy Gordon Cooper, Malcolm Scott Carpenter. They began a grueling training schedule, with von Braun explaining the Redstone rocket that soon would carry 2 of them into space aboard Mercury capsules. However, once again, the Soviets upstaged America. On April 12, 1961, Major Yuri Gagarin of the Soviet Air Force was rocketed into orbit by a Vostok 1 spacecraft to become the first man in space. But at last, Mercury was ready for manned flight. The first astronaut would face great dangers in a program that already had produced a number of spectacular failures. And there would be more. Three weeks after Gagarin's triumph on May 5, 1961, astronaut Alan Shepard made America's first suborbital flight and set the nation on the path to the moon.
Alan Shepard, the members of the House and Senate Space Committee who are with us today, and this decoration, which has gone from the ground up here.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Neither Shepard nor Grissom, who had followed in another suborbital flight, had achieved orbit. This required the larger, trouble-plagued Atlas intercontinental ballistic missile. On February 20th, 1962, John Glenn became the first American astronaut to orbit the Earth. And the nation gave a collective sigh of relief.
Lots of grades fired, okay.
Glenn and his fellow astronauts received a hero's welcome. New York gave them a parade larger than any since Charles Lindbergh's in 1927, as the nation was swept by a wave of patriotism. After Glenn, 4 more astronauts would orbit the Earth in Mercury spacecraft. The next step toward landing a man on the moon was now at hand. As laid out in America's blueprint for space, Project Gemini used a more advanced launch vehicle that carried a 2-man crew. It was designed for docking and other maneuvers that would be implemented during the coming Apollo flights. 10 manned Gemini missions were performed in 1965 and 1966.
Okay, my feet are out. Okay, I'm out.
Okay, now, slow 3.
I think I'm dragging a little bit, so I don't want to fire this.
Anyone who watched astronaut Ed White perform America's first walk in space in Gemini 4 will never forget the spectacle. Gemini 6 and 7 rendezvoused in orbit and maneuvered in close formation.
We can very clearly see the Horizon scanners operate.
Roger,
Gemini 12 repeated the success of previous flights in carrying out docking maneuvers. In November of 1966, the successful Gemini program was completed, and the eager crews were ready for the great moon voyage. Well before the Gemini missions came to a close, NASA had been working day and night organizing the far-reaching Apollo program and developing its giant launch vehicles, the Saturn 1B and Saturn 5. During a visit to the Marshall Space Flight Center in 1960, von Braun had explained the operation of the Saturn rockets to President Eisenhower and the role they would play in a future lunar program. But Eisenhower was not enthusiastic about an expanded American space program, which resulted in the United States falling far behind the Russians. In May 1961, Eisenhower's conservative space policies were dramatically reversed by President John F. Kennedy and his Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, who was also a strong space advocate. Von Braun assured them that it was possible to beat the Russians to the moon. The president then made a courageous decision and committed America to the Apollo program. The sheer bravado of his announcement was remarkable. Project Apollo is viewed as a turning point in world history, a marvel of scientific and technical ingenuity organized and carried out on a scale of historic proportions. It is even more astonishing because it was accomplished during a period of great domestic turmoil. For the Apollo program, NASA committed 12,000 of its employees, while 17,000 American firms employed 300,000 engineers and scientists in the massive endeavor. In late 1968, all of the parts of this immense program came together. At the Kennedy Space Center, von Braun's gigantic Saturn V is carried to the launch pad by its enormous transporter. The giant rocket is one of mankind's greatest technological triumphs. The largest, most powerful machine ever constructed. One that will carry 3 men to the moon and return them safely to the Earth. Apollo 11 was to be the first mission to land men on the moon, but 6 additional Apollo flights would follow, each writing their own crucial chapter in the history of spaceflight. Since earliest time, man has imagined this moment. The moment when he would make the first journey to the moon. Now the time had come. In the 7th decade of the 20th century, the ancient dream was about to become a reality. The world held its breath while 1 billion people around the globe watched.
Fifteen, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. Engines on. 5, o'clock, 49 minutes past the hour.
Astronauts Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins rose through the atmosphere and entered not only the vacuum of space, but a trip through time. The journey was to become a key to the future, and later, a nostalgic remembrance of the past.
Feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drifting to the right a little. Contact light. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Yeah, I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind. Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one.
The lunar landing crew of Apollo 12, Conrad and Bean, visited Surveyor 3, an unmanned spacecraft that landed on the moon in 1967. Apollo 14's Mitchell and Shepard were the first to explore the lunar highlands. They landed near Frau Mauro, a large impact crater, while astronaut Rusa orbited above in the command service module. Mitchell and Shepard placed instruments on the moon to record a wide range of scientific activities. The rock samples they obtained were very different, and in fact were much older than those from the Apollo 11 mission. Apollo 15 astronauts Scott and Irwin also landed in a mountainous region, where they first tried out the lunar rover vehicle and explored the area around Hadley Rill, a deep canyon.
Well, I can see I'm going to have to keep my eye on the road. Boy, it's really rolling hills, Joe. Just like 14. Up and down we go. Look at that. Oh, look back there, Jim. Look at that. That's beautiful. That is spectacular. This is unreal. The most beautiful thing I've ever seen.
In March 1972, Apollo 16 astronauts, Duke and Young, landed in the Descartes Highland, covering 16 miles in their rover, collecting rock samples and setting up scientific instruments.
Man, does this thing have steep walls. They said 60 degrees. Now, I tell you, I can't see to the bottom of it, and I'm as close to the edge as I'm going to get.
Apollo 17, the last of the Apollo missions, landed in December of that year in a valley in the rugged Taurus mountain region. Astronaut Schmidt, who was the only scientist to visit the moon, was assisted by fellow astronaut Cernan in gathering 240 pounds of extraordinary lunar rock and soil samples.
That's incredible. You need to get it down, son. Holy smoly. Why are we on a slope? You okay? Let's see if I can't crack the corner and get that contact. See if I can't get
Apollo achieved all of its scientific goals. But more importantly, it established that there were no impenetrable barriers blocking man's progress into space. Skylab, a two-story orbital workshop, was the next manned spaceflight endeavor. 3 separate 3-man crews would visit and live in the orbiting laboratory in 1973 and 1974. One crew remained for nearly 3 months, proving that astronauts could withstand extended stays in space and continue to do useful work. Soon after, in 1975, the United States and the Soviet Union cooperated in the Apollo-Soyuz test project. The mission called for docking and crew exchange to develop the necessary equipment for space rescues. Despite the success of Apollo, a less costly method to transport materials into space was badly needed. In 1981, the United States launched Columbia, its first shuttle. The shuttle is a multi-purpose spacecraft that is reused and carries astronauts and equipment into space and then returns to Earth, landing like a conventional airplane. Despite the tragic loss of the Challenger, the shuttle program has proven to be durable and successful. Its achievements include using the space environment for the benefit of humankind. The skills and courage of the dedicated multinational shuttle crews has drawn the admiration of the world community. During the rest of this century, the shuttle will continue to perform important tasks. Vital programs include environmental monitoring of the Earth, microgravity experiments, and conducting biomedical and space research. The shuttle will also play a major role in assembly of the space station Freedom. The shuttle may eventually be replaced by a more sophisticated and economical vehicle such as the National Aerospace Plane. Its capabilities will include taking off like an airplane, traveling into space, and returning to land on a runway. Also, a new launch system will loft large cargoes directly into orbit. Both are giant new steps into the future.
T-minus 10 seconds. 8.
But America's future in space lies with its children. At the United States Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, Space Camp and Space Academy were created by von Braun and Edward Buckbee. They offer realistic space training for our future astronauts. One of today's graduates may well be the person who plants the first American flag on Mars.
Now, as you can see, this tower will become red hot, but only in a very localized area because the silicon...
I'm not proposing a 10-year plan like Apollo. I'm proposing a long-range, continuing commitment. First, for the coming decade, for the 1990s, Space Station Freedom, our critical next step in all our space endeavors, and next, for the new century, back to the moon, back to the future, and this time, back to stay. And then a journey into tomorrow, a journey to another planet, a manned mission to Mars.
Over 40 years ago, von Braun visualized in detailed studies scenarios that could be used to establish lunar colonies and the manner of exploring Mars. When these studies are compared to NASA's current space exploration initiative for the next 50 years, you quickly discover startling similarities, for it closely follows von Braun's grand blueprint for space. Von Braun's blueprint called for establishing a lunar colony by first assembling a fleet of space vehicles in orbit close to his donut-shaped space station. The fleet consisted of a lunar cargo ship and 2 lunar passenger ships. His plan called for all 3 spacecraft to descend to the lunar surface. The 2 passenger ships would each carry a crew of 20, and the cargo ship a crew of 10. Hydraulic legs would absorb the shock and automatically level the craft. Ample living quarters would be provided for the crew. The cargo ship, once on the surface, was to have been split in halves, with the 2 sections serving as living quarters and scientific laboratory. To protect the explorers, it was planned to locate the base in a crevice, construction materials were to be lowered by a crane mounted on a tractor. At the end of the expedition, the crews would return to Earth orbit aboard the 2 passenger ships, but not before using tractors to explore the lunar surface. Shadow areas of this crater are illuminated by reflected Earth light. Small rockets with explosive charges were to be used for seismic studies of lunar interior structure. Apollo 16 employed the same method using mortar grenades. Today, NASA's plans are much the same, but of course more advanced technology would be employed. It has been over 20 years since the Apollo astronauts left their footprints on the moon. Hopefully, explorers will return early next century, not just to visit, but to establish permanent outposts. Tomorrow, astronauts will not only explore and perform scientific experiments, but seek out resources and select sites for permanent outposts. Later, pioneers of these settlements will gradually become less and less dependent on Mother Earth. The colonists must develop skills and techniques that will allow them to live off the land. They will also conduct vital research into geology, astronomy, and life sciences. The experience gained will prove invaluable for future exploration of Mars and other planetary bodies. Eventually, mankind will develop resources found on other planets. Here on the moon, we can begin to plan for the development of local resources and the manufacture of products for export to Earth. This stunning view of Earth was produced by the unmanned spacecraft Galileo. Without such probes, the accomplishments of manned flight would have been severely limited, as they are the first explorers, preceding man into the solar system and beyond. Names like Viking, Explorer, Pioneer, Mariner, Voyager, Magellan, Galileo are part of our space heritage. Beginning in 1990, the spacecraft Magellan began peering through the thick, swirling clouds of Venus to reveal its surface in unsurpassed detail, including the beautiful canyon, Artemis. The volcano with the fluted rim is unofficially called the Tick. During the same year, the Voyager 2 spacecraft captured amazing photographic images of Miranda, a geologically interesting moon of the planet Uranus. Then on October 29, 1991, Galileo photographed the first images ever seen of an asteroid, 11-mile-long Gospra. The planet Mars has intrigued mankind for centuries. Less than half the size of Earth, it is nevertheless the most inviting world in our solar system for permanent human habitation. In 1954, von Braun presented a well-thought-out plan for the exploration and colonization of Mars. He envisioned the assembly in Earth orbit, near his familiar space station, of a large fleet of spacecraft. The expedition he proposed was to consist of 10 spaceships, a crew of 70, travel distance of 355 million miles, and a round-trip time of 2.5 years, including 15 months on the Martian surface. Upon reaching Mars orbit, von Braun planned to prepare 3 winged spacecraft to land on the surface. At the time, scientists believed the atmosphere was sufficiently dense to support a winged landing. Today, we know it's too thin. The first winged lander was to touch down near the North Pole. Crew members would travel toward the equator in inflatable pressurized spheres mounted on tractors. On arrival, they would prepare a site for the other 2 landers. After a stay of 15 months, the explorers would lift off and rendezvous with the craft in orbit and return to Earth. Today, America's new space exploration initiative climaxes with a bold mission to Mars with the goal of exploration and establishing permanent human outposts. In one scenario, the grand adventure begins with a Mars spaceship assembled in orbit from components brought up from Earth by earlier heavy-lift vehicles. Once the Mars ship has been completed, a shuttle brings in the flight crew and the long interplanetary journey begins. Before a Mars landing is accomplished, it may be decided to first establish a base of operation on one of Mars' 2 moons, Phobos or Deimos. Sites for landing on the planet below may be selected from these vantage points. Another scenario contemplates a direct landing on Mars. Several different types of spacecraft could be involved. Many scientists feel that nuclear electric propulsion or another advanced system will be necessary for the flight. The prototype of such an engine has already been tested. Although the Martian atmosphere is very thin, a heat shield will be necessary to protect the spacecraft in its fiery plunge toward the surface. An initial Martian goal may be to establish a few science outposts on the surface. Though not necessarily permanent, they would be capable of supporting explorers while they conduct scientific studies on the Red Planet. Most intriguing of all would be the discovery of actual or perhaps fossil evidence of a primitive life form. The explorers would also determine the possibility of extracting useful resources on Mars that would be needed by future colonists. In some distant future, locally manufactured products may even be exported back to Earth. In 1976, 2 remarkable Viking spacecraft arrived at Mars. The lander portions descended to the Martian surface, while the orbiters circling above took 50,000 images of the planet. JPL scientists have utilized these to create the following data visualization of a flight over the surface. In the distant past, Mars had streams, rivers, lakes, and perhaps oceans. Many scientists believe that it is possible to recreate those conditions by employing a process known as terraforming. The technology to accomplish this is now understood. By slowly raising the temperature of the Martian atmosphere, vast amounts of water could be released from the polar caps and from underground reservoirs. The first in many complex steps will have been taken to make Mars a living planet similar to this artist's conception after the terraforming has been completed. In the not-too-distant future, mankind will explore many of the planets and moons of our solar system. NASA's present mission of discovery captures the essence of the human spirit, the need to explore, to push back frontiers, and to map new worlds. Someday, a giant spaceship may leave our solar system, carrying colonists on the grand adventure to reach the stars. An adventure that began when a man named Wernher von Braun designed his first rocket in the 3rd decade of the 20th century.
The world owes Wernher von Braun a great debt. His visions and imagination in the 1950s led to America's space triumphs in the 1960s and early 1970s. Imagination and vision are once again needed to pave the way to further triumphs in the years and decades ahead. We need to inspire a new generation with the wonders, the excitement, and the promise of endless space.